Solving an international crisis through global diplomacy. Face-to-face meetings used to be considered a must, but COVID-19 stopped that. Digital diplomacy through online platforms is now key, but can it be a successful alternative? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. Face-to-face meetings are said to be the best way to bring together conflicting parties. But during the past year and a bit, the global coronavirus pandemic changed all that. Social distancing measures and health and travel restrictions forced world leaders to switch to virtual talks, and diplomats had to negotiate and persuade while adapting to the relatively new technological advances. The diplomatic calendar was completely disrupted by COVID-19, but right up to date, some talks are now taking place in person. The G7 foreign ministers have met face-to-face for the first time in 2 years after a COVID-19 pause. It's a chance for the world's leading economies to hold informal discussions missing during video conferences. The ministers avoided handshakes and took health safety precautions. But the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken did not fly to Kenya or Nigeria for his first Africa tour last month. The Secretary of State met with leaders of both countries virtually. He also engaged with young African people and went online to visit local renewable energy companies. And President Joe Biden has switched to virtual diplomacy in his climate change talks with world leaders. He has attempted to get a consensus from countries on cutting greenhouse emissions through an online summit hosted from the White House. But leaders of the Southeast Asian Nations Association, ASEAN, have met face-to-face to discuss Myanmar's crisis. The talks held under strict social distancing and health measures. The UN General Assembly annual meeting is one of the main events of the global diplomatic calendar. But this year, it was held virtually for the first time. The podium was empty and there was no hustling and bustling of diplomats. So there were no physical gaffes, awkward handshakes, or unexpected laughter by delegates, as was the case in reaction to remarks from former US President Donald Trump in 2018. Let's bring in our guest in Oxford, Tom Fletcher. He is principal of Hertford College at Oxford University and foreign policy advisor to 3 UK prime ministers. In Brussels, Theresa Fallon, she is the director of the Centre for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. From Pretoria, Yusuf Amrani, Morocco's ambassador to South Africa. Welcome to the program. Tom, we're all trying to adapt to the new realities following the spread of COVID-19. How has it affected global diplomacy?
Well, in massive ways. As with every other industry, most diplomacy has been happening online, just like this, by Zoom, by Skype over the last year and a half. And COVID knocked out a number of big international conferences that would normally have taken place in 2020. You have to remember that diplomacy is one of the last crafts that depends on the handshake, literally the handshake at the end of a peace deal. And so the last 3 feet, that human contact, is incredibly important. And that's what diplomats have been lacking in the last year.
Theresa, as Tom has just said, the handshakes, the photo opportunities, the gatherings, those were landmark events, particularly in places like Brussels with NATO and European Union. How has that changed now with COVID-19?
I think it's changed dramatically because so much information has not been leaked. You can't imagine how much information is exchanged on the sidelines of major events. And all of that has been sanitized. And it's very, very difficult and frustrating for many people to get that needed information. But now that COVID is slowly being lifted, these sanctions on how people can move. I even had a meeting this last week in a park with a diplomat, and we walked for over an hour. We didn't even feel the time pass. So we were just so relieved, as Tom mentioned, to have that human contact to talk in person. I've had many introductions via email to talk to someone, and the exchanges are never very warm or actually very informative. I find the person-to-person contact is far more helpful. So I think that this is a big change for everybody.
Yusuf, the person-to-person contact and now to finding refuge in virtual reality to carry out your duties. Could you give us a sense of how it has affected your work as an ambassador?
Well, the global COVID-19 pandemic has imposed a new reality to which we all have to adapt. And diplomats, ambassadors make no exception. The pandemic has challenged the way we do and perform our work, has challenged also the way we interact with one another, and the way also the world conceives cooperation schemes and diplomacy. So this threat has led us to question what we used to take for granted. And the main consequence for us as people in the ground is that it has highlighted the need to secure and strengthen the resilience of the international rule-based order. So combating the virus became the primary struggle of an international community in, if I may say so, engage in a deadlock against uncertainty. However, although this ambition was global and collective, action that we had to take, unfortunately, had not reached the comprehensive and concerted approach.
All right. Tom, diplomacy is in a way or another the art of negotiation, where you need to be face-to-face with the one you're talking to try to get to a common ground. Could it be an indication that now with COVID-19 that traditional diplomacy or diplomacy as we've known it is part of history?
So it's an important part of history, but it's also an important part of the future because of all of these challenges, which you've heard about just there. You know, the answer to all of them involves diplomacy in some ways. Now, perhaps what we've learned is that the answer to every 21st challenge isn't always an international conference, but we have learned that you do need that national cooperation that Ambassador Ambrani just described there. You do need that human contact that Theresa described in order to find the solutions to these challenges. So I think diplomacy will evolve again. Diplomacy is Darwinian. It has always changed. It changed when ships came along, when the stirrup came along and you could ride horses. It changed when the telephone came along. Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary, said at the time, my God, it's the end of diplomacy. And of course, diplomacy survived. So it will evolve and it will change and it will improve, but it will be a crucial part of actually finding the answers to these challenges that we've described.
Theresa, back in March, April, May last year, parents were grappling all over the world about whether hybrid learning was going to be efficient. And I'm going to ask you the same question, but this time about hybrid diplomacy. Do you think it has been efficient so far in places like Brussels?
I think it's something that will be here to stay. Of course, nothing will replace the human-to-human contact, but the economics of it. You could have many events and invite people from all over the world, which people weren't able to do in the past. So I think that we'll see a hybrid of this in the future because of the pure economics of it. And you don't need to have transport costs and putting up someone in a hotel. And also, we can see, for example, with President Biden, he was able to attend events that no U.S. president had attended in the past. For example, at this year's Munich Security Conference, he was the first U.S. president to speak at it because it was virtual. He was able to appear, and everyone took that as a very promising sign. So I think there are some positive points about this as well. I've even spoken at the U.S. Congress. I wouldn't have been asked before because I'm based in Brussels, and they even said we would just pay for a rail ticket for someone maybe based in New York or on the East Coast of the U.S. So I was able to speak there. So I think people are able to source more expertise from around the world. So that is the upside. But I think the expansion of digital diplomacy is also another key development. It was already in existence before COVID-19, but we've seen it really as a catalyst. It's really expanded much more dramatically.
Ambassador Yusuf, do you see a benefit here in the sense that the first time you don't have to really think about traveling all over the globe? dealing with jet set realities, time differences, all the hustle that comes with traveling. Now you are confined to a place, you're talking to people as long as it takes to come up to a certain sense of agreement.
Yeah, let's be clear. We had to adapt as far as tools, as far as approaches. And in the time of pandemic, the digital technology has allowed us as diplomats to stay connected to the world and to our partners, which is essential. For the first time, I have 40 years of foreign policy, of diplomacy. For the first time in 40 years, we experienced diplomacy through digital technology that is today accessible. And the diplomat, as diplomat, we had to come out of our bubble and create direct link with the outside world, with our partners, with our foreign ministers, and to negotiate. And I had to make some demarches on very important issues by this technology. But this being said, and I'm happy to agree with my friend Fletcher. I didn't know that he was in this panel. This being said, nothing can replace direct contact.
Fair enough.
And negotiations room, where one can find the best possible compromise through direct human interaction. Let me say one word.
Okay.
Digital technology cannot replace human contact. It must be a vector of rapprochement, but not a replacement.
All right. Tom, there is an issue here. Paparazzis in the past were all the time looking for the right moment to capture that gaffe, which was making headlines. Today, there are concerns about technological safety and also glitches, and particularly the case of the social media post by the China's law enforcement body, which was juxtaposed in the country's launch of a module into space with the cremation piles in India, which was deleted later. Could this be something that world leaders, diplomats all over the world have to be really careful about in the future?
Yeah, so there's some clear positives. And as you've heard, we're not collectively as diplomats leaving such a huge carbon footprint behind us. And so that is a positive in itself, but there are risks. There are risks from hostile groups which can try to exploit the technology. There are basic admin and technological risks that can impede the conversation, that can get in the way of the frankness of the conversation, that human contact that you've just heard about. But I always say to ambassadors and foreign ministers who are cautious of getting involved in social media, that for me, the smartphone was both the opportunity and the threat. It was the way I could connect with young people across the Middle East, but also the means by which terrorists were tracking my movements. It was a real opportunity and a real threat. So there are real risks using this technology, but the biggest risk is not to be out there trying to leave that space to our opponents.
Theresa, there is hope that by 2023, 2024 is going to be back to normal. But doctors will tell you at the same time that we have to grapple with this new reality that viruses will be with us forever. In the meantime, what does it mean for global diplomatic centers like Brussels, Geneva, and New York? Will be seen the same?
I think I agree with Tom on this because it really is a double-edged sword. I think that this type of digital diplomacy can actually backfire very badly. We saw with China in Ireland, for example, they tweeted out a message about Aesop's fables, about the wolf, and it just backfired so badly, they had to pull the tweet from the internet. So I think that a more advanced digital diplomacy will be important. But I think also, for example, Angela Merkel, when she was president of the European Council, she had envisioned this massive Leipzig summit with the 27 EU member states plus China. Of course, that was replaced with a video meeting, but it doesn't have the same type of punch. And so, these photo opportunities, these opportunities for some information that's exchanged on the sidelines is invaluable. So I'm glad that the world has muddled through during this very difficult period of COVID-19, but I think there will be a lot of catching up to do in person. And even now, I'm seeing diplomats meeting in Brussels in open spaces. So I think that that's already taking place.
Yusuf, do you see the need for adopting new methods, changing realities as far as foreign services, ministries of foreign affairs, diplomats have to deal in the near future? I'll give you an idea. As far as you are concerned, you're operating in South Africa. You have the Addis Ababa where you meet for the African Union summits. Those things are changing with COVID. Are these things that you are putting into consideration as a diplomat?
Yeah, it's a very, you raised a very important point. Today, we have to move fast, think fast, and communicate in the moment. The risk, and I think Fletcher pointed out, the risk is to lose track too quickly. Diplomacy is a long process, deep and long-term action. So digital technology must not be an instrument that favors the moment over the future. We must use digital technology, but with control and caution. Otherwise, we risk losing relevance in trying to gain efficiency. I will give an example. As far as Morocco is concerned, our Foreign Office has taken the initiative to fully integrate digital diplomacy as a subject lectured to our young diplomats. We want to make sure that our diplomats gain skills, be able to interact with think tanks, with civil society, and also control over the digital world ahead of us. We have to accept that we need to adapt to this new situation. Of course, the diplomat work is all about impact and influence. And we need how to use these tools to fulfill our job and our task.
Tom, here where I'm a little bit concerned, particularly when it comes to conflict resolution, you send a United Nations envoy to a place like Syria or Yemen. He will have to meet with tribesmen, with warlords, with government officials, with NGOs, warring factions, convince them, conduct shuttle diplomacy, bring them to different places of the world, build confidence measures, and after years, you hope you will be able to set aside those differences. It's not going to be the case anymore with digital diplomacy.
Well, you're exactly right. Diplomacy takes huge amounts of patience. George Mitchell, who did the Northern Ireland Agreement, said that peacemaking was 799 days of failure and 1 day of success. And much diplomacy is that patient work that Ambassador Ambrani just described, of building up trust and rapport between different groups until you can get to the point where people can imagine making these sacrifices, making these commitments, making these compromises and trade-offs. And so a lot of that hasn't been happening over the last year. The other thing, of course, that hasn't been happening is, of course, there hasn't been as much resource and time for diplomacy. The attention of governments has been elsewhere. We've been thinking about vaccinating our own populations. We've been thinking about just getting through the lockdowns. And so a lot of the normal, essential diplomacy that would have happened in 2020, 2021, you think of a number of peace processes, you mentioned Syria, simply the attention hasn't been there. And so there's a very, very full to-do list now for the foreign ministers of the world. It's why it's great that they're getting together in London today, the G7 foreign ministers, to actually get back into that agenda again.
Theresa, world leaders, it's no secret that world leaders, ministers of foreign affairs, when they travel, it's costly. It costs a lot for the budget of their own governments. This time with digital diplomacy, it's very cost effective in a way or another. Biden had to conduct most of his meetings virtually without having to get out of the US. Could this be something that would be taken seriously by governments in the near future and save that money for something else like PR or public diplomacy?
Well, I think it could really be beneficial in the early stages or in signaling. But I think for clinching final deals, nothing will replace the person-to-person meetings. But I think that as President Biden has really shown, he's an older man. This can really work to his benefit if he doesn't have to travel. President Trump was often exhausted after these very long trips, so he mightn't have performed as well as if someone had been very well rested. So I suspect that this will continue. And we've also seen digital diplomacy in unexpected ways. For example, before the Biden administration came to power, because of rules inside the United States, of course, there's only one president at a time, and they were not allowed to communicate with other world leaders. So Jake Sullivan sent out a tweet telling the Europeans, please wait, we're coming into office in 3 weeks, please wait about signing this agreement with China. So we've seen kind of an evolution in digital diplomacy that we hadn't seen in the past. That's the first time I can think of that Twitter was used as a way to signal from the incoming presidential administration, because they're not really allowed to talk to world leaders, so that it was transparent, everyone could see it, and it was just addressed to, you know, the Twitterverse. So I think that people are getting more creative in using these tools as well.
Ambassador Amrani, when it comes to diplomacy, one of the key components of diplomacy is talks behind closed doors. And I bet nothing will compensate for that. The moment you go on Zoom, you will be carefully crafting the language you will be using. You'll be concerned about a backlash. And how to deal with this in the near future?
Empathy is necessary in the conduct of diplomatic action in line with the challenges of today and tomorrow. And I would like to say 2 words. Diplomats are called upon today to advocate for renewed multilateralism and sustainable globalization. Of course, if COVID-19 has been a crisis of rupture, the diplomatic response must be the one that rebuilds coherent and solid foundation for the international order. No, and you were talking, I will talk as African on the management of conflict, and I will give you 2 examples that I left. First, Libya. When we agreed in Skhewat on the package on Libya a few years ago, we could not do it through Zoom or through, it's impossible, because the different parties to the conflict, they didn't want to sit to each other, they didn't want to talk to each other. And thanks to this classic diplomacy, we were able to put them together, to work, to talk together, to have dinner together. And you cannot have dinner through Zoom, to be able to move. And this is thanks to the role that has been driven by Special Envoy Bernardino Leon. The second example, only a few weeks ago, we had difficulties in the African Union through Zoom, to negotiate a resolution, to make the amendments, to work closed doors, to gather in small groups. We need this human, because diplomacy is something human. We need this contact.
Okay.
So if, and I will summarize, we were able to face the challenges during the COVID with this technology, I think the future we will resume. And I'm really very, very happy to see that we are now going through this pandemic.
All right, Tom, I know that I've been asking loads of questions about the financial aspect of the whole thing, but I would like just to go back to one thing with you, which is basically, at least we've seen something positive coming out here, which is basically you don't really need to have the same large retinue number of staff operating in places like New York, Geneva and Brussels. You can work with the minimum stuff and you can do it extremely well with digital diplomacy.
Absolutely. And actually, this predated the pandemic and the lockdowns. I've been arguing for some time that we need to strip away a lot of the paraphernalia from diplomacy, which I think actually slows diplomacy down. A lot of the protocol and the pageantry and the grip and grins and the brush buys and all of that sort of thing, I think can often get in the way of real human contact, the essentials of diplomacy that we've described. I do hope as well that as a result of the pandemic, it will accelerate the trend towards communicating more effectively why diplomacy matters. I've always protested against the kind of platitudes, the sort of diplomatic statements where we say, Britain and France have warm bilateral relations and we discussed issues of mutual concern, sort of meaningless descriptions of meetings. I'd much rather we communicated more honestly and openly with the public about what we do. And I think then they would better understand why it actually makes a difference to their lives. And I think then we would find there was more support for the business of diplomacy.
I will have to leave it there, but it was good talking to you, Theresa Fallon, Tom Fletcher, Ambassador Yusuf Amrani. I really appreciate your insight. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.